We have our very last speaker for the day, and Bruce has been waiting very patiently on Zoom, no doubt. Bruce is from Adelaide, from the Trobe University, and he's going to talk to us about compassion and grief support. Bruce's multidisciplinary interests are supported by postgraduate qualifications in physics, practical theology, and health social science. Prior to joining La Trobe University, he was Foundation Professor of Pastoral Studies at what is now the University of Divinity, Melbourne. In 2005, he was awarded an OAM for services to palliative care and pastoral care, particularly as an educator.
Well, thanks, Leanne. Is that the cue for me to start talking, I guess? Look, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for bringing me slightly closer to West Australia, because I'm actually lurking in Melbourne now as the dark starts to fall. It's been a really rich and rewarding and I would imagine exhausting day for you all. And I'm sorry to be yet another talking head to finish the day. But what I want to do is to try to offer some observations, I guess, on something of the process we've been through together in the day. And to do that, I'll go back to the beginning with Alan Kelleher and the idea of a compassionate community which takes seriously a commitment to caring for people at end of life. And Alan, of course, was picking up the way in which our structures or a community might be structured to do that. And we had actually some really helpful and practical examples of that there, particularly in the morning session. But I guess I'd want to remind you too of that compassion is something which is called out by human suffering, but also something which is a whole worldview. It is to do, I think, with perceiving our shared humanity. It's the fundamental social emotion, Martha Nussbaum says. It is to recognize that we are all connected, and that in your suffering, I also experience suffering and share my knowledge and hope and pain with you. So compassion, in this sort of sense, compassion which recognizes our common humanity, expands our horizons, expands our communities. It connects us not just with people we like, but with people we don't like. It connects us with people who respond just the way we do and people who respond quite differently from the way we do. So compassion, while it may be felt and called out by suffering, is actually fundamentally a way of seeing and being and acting in the world. Hence, compassion will shape our relationships and who we are, because we exist in relationship with others. Identity and our communities are inextricably linked. And throughout our lives, we are immersed in community, hatched out of community, withdrawn from or exit from, reinvest ourselves in ways that shape our whole sense of who we are and of who we might become. So that while we shape our communities by our choices and our identity, our communities also shape us. And Robert Keegan, using those C's, talks about the way in which at each stage of our life we need confirmation and challenge and continuity. That is, we need to be accepted as who we are, offered a vision of what we might become, be reminded of where we have been. And it's particularly around end-of-life issues in our society that until quite recently we have lacked those visions of what we might become, as a religious view of life has perhaps waned in many circles. The possibilities opened up by death and grief are things which we have not even entertained or we've shied away from. So it's possible, I guess, to mount all sorts of arguments in support of compassionate communities, and we've heard some of them today. There's plenty of epidemiological and economic evidence to do so, but fundamentally, I want to finish up by suggesting that Compassionate communities are supported by stories, because stories do all sorts of things for us. They alarm and inspire, they outline problems and solutions, they warn us and give us possibilities, they encode our values and make connections. And fundamentally, too, working with stories can save us from ourselves. They encourage us to listen, to witness, and not just to pronounce on other people, to make judgments or to pass judgments. So stories create and maintain community. Stories need to be told because they validate people's experience, and we're seeing a rush of those in society today. Stories around assault and the stolen generation and the pandemic of isolation and long COVID diary, you can name it, that stories need to be told and need to be heard, because storytellers need an audience. And it's only as an audience hears a story and responds to it that the story can continue to develop and to shift. As we've seen, as we've heard from the stories of those who've been silenced for a long time, stories that remain untold can have real consequences for people who cannot find an audience. And we're also beginning to see that stories that are told can change communities that are prepared to listen. So when it comes to end-of-life stories, a compassionate community that wants to celebrate and expand the telling of end-of-life stories and take action on those stories, we have a starting point of silence until quite recently. For most of the 20th century, our society handed over responsibility for managing end-of-life care to healthcare practitioners, and many of them struggled and still struggle with this burden. And that sort of handover of responsibility, saying, look, the experts can look after it, is something which put limits on the stories which were heard. For a long time, you didn't hear the stories of dying people's experience. It was only with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and Dame Cicely Saunders that those stories began to re-emerge within society. And even then, many of those stories were taken up still into a healthcare framework. It was the healthcare storytellers that were endorsed, and they became the audiences. And so often people who were dying or grieving found themselves telling selected bits of their stories to various expert audiences of one, which not only fragmented the experience of dying, but even more so the experience of bereavement, which after all is an open-ended experience. We live with loss for the rest of our lives. Consequently, a lot of our information about grief in the modern world comes from people who found their grief a problem and went to see a counsellor about it. And that is one of the issues of which we still deal as we found or form compassionate communities. Compassionate communities go beyond the audience of one to open up multiple audiences when we recognise that care is everyone's responsibility. And so we have a whole series of questions that we begin to explore. In fact, we've been exploring today. How can the everyday end-of-life stories be told and heard? How can it be inclusive so that experiences which have been marginalised be brought into the centre of the story? How can the stories that are told be accessible to other people, both to inspire and to inform and to challenge? How can they be the basis of a call of action? And so we asked questions about the audiences for grief within a compassionate community. Tony Walter suggests that, in fact, many bereaved people want to talk to others who knew the dead person. He suggests that the audience needs to be those who knew and were part of that person's community, because he argues, and I think he's right, that the purpose of grief is not to move away from the person who has died, but rather to find a secure place, to work out what my relationship with them is now. Grieving, mourning, bereavement is a process of finding, who is this person for me now? How does this person continue to inspire me and inform me? How do they challenge me? What's the legacy to me? What do I need to pick up or carry forward of that legacy? What are the things from which I am now freed because they can no longer continue? What do I need? How do I need to change my behaviors because I have learned from them that I don't actually want to engage the world that way? It's that sort of ongoing story about after you've been listening to for a long time to somebody talking about all the things they miss about a person who has died, you can then also ask the question, and what don't you miss? And you start to hear often some quite interesting information. But what this means, if we take this idea seriously, is that a compassionate community is one that involves both the living and the dead. That in many ways, in our ongoing interactions and conversations and experiences, the dead continue to participate in our lives. A while ago, recognizing the way in which a lot of the literature around bereavement supporting grief, seemed to be skewed toward professional activity, grief counseling and so forth, somehow led a survey, which looked at where people actually get their bereavement support. In other words, instead of asking people who are clients of counsellors how they understood their grief, we asked the general community. And this is the sort of stuff we came up with. That the primary sources of support, family, friends, and interesting, funeral provider. And I think Adrian's example from the last address might give us a clue that what happens, the funeral provider is somebody who can actually put shape around the chaos that happens at around the point of death. But it's family and friends and other ongoing people who are part of a person's community who are the providers, the fundamental providers of support. And professional interventions come, well, actually a fair way down the list, both in terms of use and even more telling when we look at the people's responses about what's helpful or not helpful. Professional interventions get a pretty mixed bag when you look at the results down there. So once again, family, funeral provider, friends, these are the people. And for others, psychologists, spiritual religious advisor, counsellor, these are the people who are, by and large, or overwhelmingly, for most cases, helpful. So we come up with a picture where it's really only a small proportion of people who are at high risk of having complicated grief and needing a professional intervention. These are usually people who already have a pretty bothered life, and the bereavement is a thing that knocks them off their perch, as it were. In contrast, the majority of people can deal with their grief with the resources already available to them, the networks of friends and family and others who are part of their lives. And there's a group in the middle who will need some additional support, a conversation, an activity group, or somebody they can touch base with, who will help them to move forward. So in that sense, bereavement, I guess, is a discovery of who we are now as a bereaved person. And there are perhaps a few comments that are worth making about that. One of them has already been alluded to by Adrian. That's the dual process thing. And in a sense, what I suppose you could say it means is not many people want to tell their story all the time or to everyone who inquires about it. Sometimes we need to maintain our professional identity or whatever it might be in order to occupy a space where we continue to feel competent rather than revisit that space where we feel as though our lives are in pieces. So we move backwards and forwards between the known and the unknown, as it were, within this whole sort of process. It's also worth remembering that not everyone can tell their story when they're in the middle of that story, as Margaret Atwood reminds us. Often it's only afterwards, when it becomes a story, as we start to tell it to ourselves or to somebody else. Within a compassionate community, we have the opportunity to be part of a receptive audience. And that, I suppose, includes doing things like this, encouraging people to speak or to write or illustrate or represent or dance or act out their stories. But listening to those accounts, it's helpful if we can keep an ear open for some of the things which might appear to be missing. What's being marginalised, pushed to the edges? What's being excluded because it seems that somebody doesn't want to talk about it? What has a person not even imagined or included within their story? And sometimes those gaps or missing strands can be picked up by offering people other illness or loss stories as a prompt or guide. It's important to resource and support other people's networks and to realise that in a compassionate community, all the listening is not down to me. I may only have a very small part in eliciting this person's overall story. The important thing is that I do what I can in that circumstance. Lots of stories around, but I won't stay with that. I would, however, make the comment about listening for the layers of an emerging story that, by and large, it's a bit of a generalization, but by and large, in bereavement, we often start telling a story about the events. It's almost in a sense, we get the story outside ourselves by talking about what's happened and what went on and the nuts and bolts of it all. But as the story emerges, it becomes enriched and deepened. We start to talk about the impact upon ourselves. So what it means for me is this. And then further, we start to talk about what it means. I now see the world in this sort of way. And so the careful listener is somebody who will listen for the layers as they emerge and encourage or inquire about the next layer that comes up. The ideas about relationships that turn up in a recital of events, or the ideas about meaning that turn up as people reflect upon relationships. It's worth remembering too that I guess outcomes aren't predictable. And every year when we teach a class with paramedical students at Trobe, we ask them to write a lossography, dreadful word, but it's a story of loss. And the sort of things that come up, it's very clear that the same loss, say the loss of a grandparent or the loss of a pet, can have massively different impact on people's lives. That the loss becomes part of people in some way. Sometimes it contributes to resilience, sometimes more to vulnerability. That family patterns can be set by the way loss is handled or shaped the way in which the loss is handled, that beliefs matter about response to loss. But fundamentally, as a listener, our role is to navigate this pathway, I guess it is, between the way we expected life to be and the way it actually is. It can be a rocky, it can be a difficult, it can be a painful time. And so it's a reminder to us that a compassionate city is actually an uncomfortable city. It's a place where, because we are attuned to the suffering of others, which reminds us in turn of our own suffering and struggles, we grow through discomfort and we learn to treat neighbours as we would wish to be treated. And fundamentally, I guess, as Jeffrey Sachs reminds us, compassion is the glue that holds society together, that informs good citizenship. And it is as good citizens that we support each other in all aspects of living and dying and grieving. Thanks.
Am I on? Yep, there I am. Thank you so much, Bruce. Now, just to share with you all, if Bruce is still there, as you know, we were going
to... I believe I am.
You're still here. I want to see if you'll join us, Bruce, so please stay on.